I thought before we started it might be helpful if we sort of collectively pooled our thoughts about, and it's going to take Sophie longer because she knows the work better than we do, but our sort of collective thoughts about why we think Geoffrey Hill is important, and also, what aspects of Geoffrey Hill kind of matter to us. This sort of sweep of English history, particularly the medieval period, particularly the sort of 14th, 15th, 16th, even 17th century. I think that really matters to me because in English literature, I love Tolkien, but I don't feel, although he's writing English myth, for me, he doesn't actually write about an England that I can actually go and sort of find and see, in a church I can go into, or a castle I can walk up there, walk along the walls of. Whereas with Geoffrey, you're kind of immersed in England, and quite a lot of it is a historic England. And I think that the other thing that matters to me is that he's the only person that wrote about, the first person that really wrote about the Holocaust in a kind of meaningful way that gave it dignity. And I think, I often used to discuss with Geoffrey, because I thought that Pound should have been shot after the war, and I felt that Geoffrey sort of revered him, and I think he tried to distinguish between sort of Pound the man and Pound the writer. But I'm sort of more angry than that in a way, and I think Pound, for his tacit participation in the Holocaust, should have been put up against a wall and shot. I don't care much for T.S. Eliot with his sort of casual anti-Semitism. But then, as I said to Geoffrey, I come from one of three people who escaped from a shtetl in the middle of Lithuania, and every other one of the 1,143 ones of my relatives out there were all killed. And therefore, I think you have to write about the Holocaust, you have to confront it, you don't need to be Jewish to confront it, but it is, along with the sort of appalling murders of the Russian people by Stalin. I think, and also the crimes committed by Mao in China. I think, the 20th century is scarred by these appalling sort of mass murders, which were part of the landscape. I think Geoffrey wrestles with them because he has, this incredible moral compass that couldn't have been easy to live with. And I remember Vince Gillespie saying to me a year after Geoffrey died, he missed Geoffrey because of Geoffrey's moral compass, because of his insistence on the fact that we had to examine, the morality of things. And I suppose, the words that come through to me are, there's a lot of death in Geoffrey's poetry, there's a lot of blood, there's a lot of pain and human suffering. But he's at pains, I think, always to be trying to learn from that and share his thoughts and experience. So there we go. Barney, you.
Well, the thing I take from and value in the poems really is the possibility of constructing narratives around the world we live in and the world that we have come from, that exist in opposition or at some perhaps. Personally, I'm in agreement with the idea that we can't move on from the unresolved madnesses of the past because they need to be talked through and worked out. And that's what I get from this work, is the idea of rejecting a kind of amnesia that's easier and that sells things and that's ubiquitous and that's sort of what we live in. But actually there's this thing which is, as you say, I think it is a lot about the Holocaust. That's the fact that I think has powered the theatre, and I remember Peter Gill saying to me, the thing that made the Royal Court was the difficult bind of saying, once you know about Auschwitz, there's nothing you could possibly say that isn't escapist or inadequate, and yet there's nothing moral you could do that isn't try and say something that isn't dilettantish. And that to me really resonates with what's happening here, which is an attempt to kind of put the question mark deep enough down, to quote Wittgenstein. I think that's the attempt to cut through easier readings of the society we live in and try and get to the core of something. And I don't always necessarily follow this work to the end of the journey, because it's very dense, it's very complex, it's very difficult, and it takes a lot of time to spend time with, and it takes a lot of time to feel close to. But sometimes it's deeply accessible and emotional, actually, and sometimes it's quite sort of fist-pumpingly right on. And it's not all nightmarish, actually. That academic reputation, you know, the fierce intelligence of the work doesn't make it inaccessible. Sometimes it makes it spiky and fun and kind of cool. And so that's what I would take from the work, really, is an alternative facts kind of thing, an alternative facts approach to what country we actually live in, and what socially we're actually doing to each other, and what actually are the reasons that we're like we are and not something else. And that's a really exciting project, I think.
Sophie?
I remember first opening this copy of Geoffrey Hill's collected poems when I was about 18 or 19, because a friend at university had said it was really, really good. And I quickly shut it because it was difficult and I didn't understand it. So I suppose overall, Geoffrey Hill is hugely important to me. He's been probably the most important writer throughout my career and throughout my academic life and my thinking life. I opened the book again when I was feeling very, very sad and depressed. I'd left university for a year. And I found myself reading Funeral Music 8, and I still found it difficult. I was mourning my father. And but gradually something came into focus. And so I think the first thing that I'd say about why his poetry feels so important to me, and I think to many people, is a sense of difficult mourning, both historically but also hugely personally. And that sense that he has in Funeral Music 8, when the ghosts are talking, not as we are, but as we must appear. And he brought into real relief for me the way in which we may remember or misremember, the way in which self and other play out in the act of thinking about what we have lost, and the difficulty of putting oneself in a place that is not central. So difficulty. More lately, I think I've been really interested in what he tells us about bodies, the physical body. And it's always there in the beginning when he writes about flesh and blood and heft. But as he went on, he wrote so beautifully about love, and poems like The Jumping Boy and Desire, and what it's like to be an older, desiring body, and the complicating factors of that. And I ended up writing about masculinity and physicality. I had to give a paper about Geoffrey Hill's body to Geoffrey Hill as he came and sat at the back, which was the most peculiar experience. And so I think bodies, it's just he is a poet of embodiment, deeply in the body of the text as well, and how he makes his text think. And I think as a writer, and to go back to both what you were saying, Robin, about his moral compass, and Barney, what you're saying about his joy, he really makes us think about how to use language morally. And for me as a writer, not to just put quotation marks around something because I'm embarrassed by it, to think, why am I doing that? What are we doing when we use that? Language has a moral force and a grave force, and it matters. And that makes what I do every day matter, I suppose, and how we speak. And the joy, as you were talking about the joy, line, I imagine singing, I imagine getting it right. There is such joy. There's also sadness and also joy. He, in the latest Ibsen, apparently he used the word twerking, which I think, yeah. So there's just such a relish of language, both archaic and contemporary.
Yeah, and the density of language. But I think he's quite prepared at moments to be quite arch, isn't he? No, I just an extraordinary command of language. And it was interesting, at one of the creativity seminars, I started talking to him about 60s music, and he really liked Pink Floyd, and he thought Jimi Hendrix was a great guitarist. And you just suddenly, it was almost as if, you know, there was a sort of different Geoffrey emerging that was sort of that period, but that wasn't a period that actually greatly interested him. I mean, he'd never written about either of those two musical stalwarts, but he was curiously sort of all time, and yet in a way. How long did you study him for?
I wrote my finals dissertation about him. Then he appeared in my doctorate, and then I wrote an essay about him. More recently. So.
But when you were you studying at Keble when he was sort of coming
No, I was
back?
at Cambridge.
Oh, right.
And I was taught by Eric Griffith, who was a friend of Geoffrey's. And so, but I think it was just a friend of mine who just said, Geoffrey Hill is good. And I just remember my indignation when I didn't understand it, and sort of, which I usually means probably I should go back and look at something again.
But he was quite fond of the fact that he was known as GLP there. You know, greatest living poet. Well, that didn't. He thought that was sort of quite funny. I don't think he kind of accepted it.
Was it Berryman or Lowell who was obsessed about that as well? It's Berryman because he writes a letter and says, "Who's first now? Who's first now? Is it Cal?" That's it. And I can't remember. And when some other dude dies, I can't remember. And it's a funny old game, isn't it? That kind of Premier League table.
The king is dead.
Yeah.
But it's funny because I overlapped when I was here with Auden as an undergraduate, and he was sort of lurking in Christchurch in that period which had been turned into a play by Alan Bennett at the National. And one was never aware of him because he never really came out to play. He never came and performed. I mean, I always thought it was absolutely remarkable at Geoffrey Hill's lectures, Professor of Poetry lectures. The turnout was amazing. I mean, they literally had to move, the very first one, they had to move to a larger room. I mean, it was literally in the very largest room available down in the examination schools. I mean, it was incredibly popular and huge numbers of undergraduates. And I'd gone to one or two in my various times as a graduate or undergraduate here, but nothing like Geoffrey. And he used to walk very slowly up the hall, so he'd sort of enter, and he'd slowly walk up the hall looking around and sort of nodding at people he knew. But it was, I don't know, it just seemed much more important when he did it than other people had done it. Did anybody else get to any of those, Al?
Yeah, so my first experience of Geoffrey Hill, the icon, was coming in my first year to one of the creativity talks in the basement of Arco. And I think seeing him sort of embodied how I felt about coming to Oxford. This was like 4 years ago. I think it was his last year as a Professor of Poetry. And I felt so afraid, and kind of revered him, because I'd read some of his stuff in like no great detail, just come straight from secondary school. And seeing him in front of me with his big beard and just being in awe of the fact that he was there. And of course, got invited up to meet him, and I didn't dare. It was too scary. And his work then, to me, was kind of impenetrable in lots of ways. I think I was too young to... Well, not too young, but I found it impenetrable and kind of dense. Then gradually, the wit of it came to me. And like the puns. It's full of puns and irony and joking. And I just didn't pick up on that when I was younger. And Sophie spoke about the funeral music thing, and I'm that age now where I've read it for the first time, funeral music. And yeah, the 8th verse is just heartbreaking to me to read it, and especially for him to be that open in a way that reading a lot of his other poems, they're so much about Great Britain and the kind of cultural heritage of Great Britain. And then every now and then you get the little pinpricks of light, of him coming through. And the kind of vulnerability of that is something that I never expected to get from his poems when I first came to them.
I think one of the things that annoys me most about Brexit is that it's sort of done to be triumphalist about what is good about Britain and our heritage, but actually, of course, it does exactly the reverse. It means all those values are hijacked with people who have other agendas. And people are simply misguided into a sort of false jingoism that somehow their lives will be better off. And I think people who understand the bigger picture, it makes them angry, and that anger is certainly in these poems, about what is really worth salvaging from our national identity. And we have our own modern tragedy, of course, which was Iraq. And I think, I was talking to David Edgar about this the other day, probably 90-something% of writing and playwriting and plays have something, somewhere, in the very heart of them, an anger about what happened in 2004. And even worse, that it was given a sort of moral veneer that this was right. It wasn't being done for the sake of American big business and to rebuild their economy, that it had a sort of moral purpose to it. And that makes people morally angry, and that moral anger burns through a lot of this writing in the most wonderful, lambent way. And that strikes a real chord with so many people now of articulating how they feel. They can't quite find the words for it. And then suddenly you read a verse of this and it goes, yes, that's exactly how I feel. That's exactly the sort of moral outrage that I feel somewhere in my life. That's quite right. And we, certainly the last 25 years of my life and a lot of the stuff that Barney and I talk about has been stopping things disappearing into the swill of history before they've been properly examined. And you want to say, before it's conveniently, I mean, again, back to Iraq, Tony Blair's always said, isn't it time we move on? No, it isn't time to move on because it hasn't been resolved. There are things here to be discussed, to be resolved, to be talked about, not in a hysterical way, but in an insightful way. So before it disappears over the horizon, let's just bring it back and put it under examination and think about it and discuss it. And then perhaps if we come to some sort of resolution, which might even be not to have a resolution about it, it might be for it to continue into further generations, but not to be lost, not to be discarded, not to be dismissed without being properly addressed. And you see all these issues burning in this portrait, and I think that makes it brilliant.
But, when people confuse him for being some sort of advocate for the status quo, actually, for me, what comes through here is his compassion, if you like, for the people whose lives are profoundly affected by the Plantagenet kings, by Hitler. There's a profound people who lose their lives at Towton Moor. There's a profound empathy for the people who've been hit over the head in history, for the people that have suffered the consequences of sort of a naked lust for power or sort of a lunatic course that they're trying to set a nation upon. And I think, for me, you've got this sort of contrast between the fact that this is not easy poetry, it's very dense, the language is quite often very, very challenging. I think he revels in language, but at the same time, what comes out for me is his admiration of the person on the Clapham omnibus, whether it's his grandmother who worked making nails in a dog. There's that profound empathy for people that comes through. And I think perhaps it's the people who sort of bounce off the outside and think, gosh, he's writing about Plantagenet kings, he must be in favour of a sort of autocracy. They don't get below the surface to there's a profound, for me, a profound involvement in humanity. Yeah. Barney. I mean, some of these themes that sort of resonate with you, they're the sort of sense of place and people in place.
Yeah, the other thing I was just thinking about listening to everybody, I think it's really worth paying attention to how very difficult it is to construct a frame of cultural reference that feels so distinct to the preoccupations you find anywhere outside these books, actually. And harder, actually. And I find it really fascinating to try and understand whether this is the product of intense isolation or just the product of a really rigorous intellect that could dismiss the things that didn't feel important and get to the things that felt important. Because I think it's so challenging, and that's kind of one of the amazing things reading some of this work in this millennium, where one is saturated by the ideas of others, which are often quite banal ideas, really almost always quite banal ideas, and that kind of cultural saturation makes it so weird to come across. And there is, he does think H. Mirren's super, and he does talk about twerking, and there's good stuff, and like modern stuff, but really it's so distinctive, and I find that very interesting in what he's done. Is he's built sort of, it's a promontory, and it starts from the same place as all of us, but sort of step by step it goes to such a culturally distinct place, which I find really interesting. And I find that interesting about writers of the mid-20th century more broadly. My friend Alice Hamilton directed this play by a writer called Judith Burney last year, and it was about someone who'd come over from Germany during the war and then had lived in North London for the rest of their lives. And one of the things that I came away from that play thinking was there was a moment of sort of high cultural intensity where people listened to Mendelssohn piano concertos while reading non-fiction, and it will not come again. There's an extraordinary intensity and clarity of focus and intellectual rigour that has room for Danny Kaye, but actually it's just so hard. It's really hard to think that hard. And that's the other thing that I really like about Hill, is what an extraordinary achievement it is to just gather those references and connect the dots.
But then he's a spur, isn't he? He's a spur to make you want to investigate things.
Yeah.
You don't rest into his poems. You don't read the poem and finish it. It's actually a starting point for then saying, I wonder what
that is.
I wonder what that is. I wonder what happened then. I wonder what that refers to. And since I became the owner of a wood, a real wood, which I look after and tend year in, year out, I have discovered so much that is being forgotten, that whole pieces of lore about the way you treat trees and the way that blossoms come out and what you do to preserve them and when you should lop them and when you shouldn't. All these things are in danger of being lost because people are not made to feel inquisitive. I think so much of our culture and media is telling people not to be inquisitive. Don't ask questions.
Turn on and tune out.
Just wonder who's going to be kicked off the X Factor this week, because that's what should really be consuming your thought and energies. Don't be spurred into investigation, and these absolutely spur you into investigation.
And that's why he says difficulty is democratic, or because it is. And I do remember my first encounter was a sort of feeling this is a bit like a crossword puzzle, although in which he plays with those ideas in speech, and it is that spur to figure things out and the learning that comes as a result of reading those texts. Yeah. And the pressure on language, which forces one to think about it again. So if you're thinking about what you were talking about the sort of resistance it's not complicity with power or an adoration of any sort of feudalism, but what it is putting pressure on the very language and the platitudes with which power is enacted.
Yes, that's very good in that thing about demagoguery. That's a very astute point.
But I think he was increasingly disenchanted with the period of time we live in. I mean, if you look at a scientist who studies goldfish, will tell you that a goldfish has an attention span of 9 seconds. Unfortunately now, Microsoft and indeed Amazon and Google all reckon that the average human being using social media has an attention span of 8 seconds. And there's the enormous pressure to sort of to skim over the surface of things, sort of flicking between things, and as you say, not going under the surface at all, being fed things. And if you look at, whether you look at social media, politics, you know, we're being spun lines, we're being fed a political philosophy, we're being shunted towards buying this. That's the fashion. This is what we should buy. This is where we should go. This is where the opinions that we collect from other people, which are actually not our opinions or their opinions. They've been subtly fed into into social media, and actually, that's everything that Geoffrey doesn't stand for. That he does have a sort of a faith in the thinking individual able to make the right decision.
That's the one, the thinking individual. That's what is not encouraged at the moment. And I remember before Brexit happened, they did some vox pops around somewhere in Kent. And so many of the people said, I feel marginalised. I feel my voice isn't being listened to. Why I'm going to vote to leave Europe is that I'm not being listened to. As if that was somehow to blame for the fact that their opinions were no longer valued and that their imaginations weren't being fired maybe in the way they used to be. Of course, there was so much when we had agricultural industry and manufacturing industry that sort of I can never say this, compartmentalized, a certain amount to free up more time for other activities, for other cultural activities. And when that disappeared, somehow a lot of the culture went with it. I mean,
we've lost a whole artisan culture. I mean, it's exemplified by the fact that there was a shop in the Turl where they made boots and shoes for 600 or 700 years.
Gone?
That's gone.
Oh,
Duckers
no.
and the Turl has gone, and that for me just exemplifies this push towards destroying the artisan culture that was actually the backbone of England, and in many ways, because they were people who were literate, they were people who read, they were people who listened to music, and they were people whose individual contributions to life, whether they made boots, whether they tanned leather, they made things, they did things, and a lot of people's work has moved away now from having a sort of an end product. Like you can see a field that's been sown or ploughed. You can see the shoes you've made today. You can see what you did as an artisan. That whole thing, you know, we're into IKEA. We're into this awful sort of homogenization of products, and you go into people's rooms and you know what they're going to look like almost before you go into them, because there's a sort of IKEA worship going on, and handmade furniture is sort of yucky, and you know you can't give away this wonderful old brown furniture that was made by centuries of artisan because it doesn't fit into our house. It's not from IKEA.
No, but it is interesting how that joins up, isn't it? Because what you got me thinking about local history. The people who sort of obsessively know either their family trees or everyone who's ever lived in number 4 or what, you know, those. But actually it is the same thing. It is the same thing as not being able to shift brown furniture, and it is the same thing as writing about Taunton Moor, isn't it? That sort of like sort of having sticky out edges thing, which is quite good in people, and being able to play the accordion and things like that. They are somehow joined up, and therefore the music hall is joined up, and sort of not an incongruous fact in his biography, because it's about
that live encounter one of the beautiful things that Eliot wrote an essay about Mary Lloyd and about the music hall. And he said that with the death of the music hall and the rise of the television, he said we are all dying of boredom. Every child will have a television in their bedroom. And he talks about this idea of dying of boredom, but the music hall is at least we have the call and response and the human body.
But the coal mining communities, I know it was a dreadful life, but they had their music, they had their brass bands. The people that work in an IKEA superstore, they have nothing. They don't have anything. And what they have is a very thin layer of sort of, I don't know, being some sort of local football supporter. But it's not a participant culture, it's a watching culture. You're not part of anything in the same way as if you play music, you know, you're part of a local group or society, whether it's preserving houses or whatever. That sense of belonging has become very distant, I think.
And actually, this is the other thing that's maybe worth saying aloud while we're pre-recording things before the actual gig starts about Hill, but it's such a sort of truism that, but we haven't said it. But the other thing is that it's sort of a record of what it's like for all of us to live in an abandoned church, and the absolute faith-based architecture of our culture, which is where singing on Sunday, participation in group music, West Gallery music groups or whatever, or just hymns, and all the participant culture that was the church. And that's the other thing that I think Hill's really great for, is he's one of the very few people who's actually sort of got the A, courage, B, clarity to look at the fact that this Christian society is stopping being a Christian society, and how are we contorted by the past, and how are we losing valuable bits, and so on and so forth. I think that's a really important thing about him, is that we're in this sort of ruined abbey and still sort of and pretending we're not, actually, which is the thing I find really difficult, that we pretend we're not all, we pretend that the Beatles weren't off book on the Bible, and they were. They knew it all, and they went to Sunday school, and that's a really important thing to study, actually, because our moral structure is based entirely on that.
A moral structure?
I think our pre-conscious ethical structures are all in response to, I feel like we should do explaining to people.
No, that's all right. But I do think you're right, that our moral responses to things are not taking into account people like Southwell and Campion.
Yeah.
We should be reminded constantly of people in history, both as bad examples to follow and good examples to follow, who have some way permeated down and are in danger, actually, of now being lost altogether. And when you get someone like Michael Gove beginning to interfere with the GCSE syllabus, saying we should read that and we shouldn't read that, you begin to think that's very dangerous, because this man should be on every list.
Right. Okay. We'll sort of pause there and let everybody come in.